Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story, so a little background about me. I'm pretty much the opposite of a troublemaker. I keep to myself, follow rules, and generally just want to live my life peacefully. About 8 months ago, I moved into this gated community that's honestly way nicer than anywhere I've ever lived before. The houses are all perfectly manicured, the streets are spotless, and everyone seems to take pride in keeping everything looking pristine. It's one of those places where you can tell the HOA has very strict standards, which I was actually fine with at first because I figured it would help maintain property values. The one thing I was most excited about when I moved in was having a proper garage and driveway for my car. Now, I know this might sound silly to some people, but I own a 1992 Honda Civic hatchback that I've spent the last 6 years completely restoring. It's not some flashy sports car or anything expensive, but it means the world to me. I bought it as a project when I was going through a rough patch in my life, and working on it became this therapeutic thing that helped me get through some dark times. Every bolt, every piece of trim, every inch of paint was done by my own hands. The engine runs like a dream, the interior is immaculate, and the paint job is honestly better than some brand new cars I've seen on the lot. My driveway is pretty unique compared to the rest of the neighborhood. It's longer than most of the others and paved with this really nice gray stone that's completely different from the regular concrete of the street. There's also a slight elevation difference, so it's very obviously separate from the public road. When I bought the house, the realtor actually mentioned that the previous owner had specifically requested the upgraded driveway materials, which cost them extra but made the property stand out. For the first few months, everything was great. I kept my car parked in the driveway, always made sure it was clean, and never had any issues with neighbors or the HOA. I'd see other residents walking their dogs or jogging past, and they'd sometimes stop to admire the car. A few even asked about the restoration work, and I was always happy to chat about it, but then I started noticing this one woman who seemed to be paying way too much attention to my property. She'd walk by multiple times a day, sometimes stopping to stare at my car for what felt like an uncomfortably long time. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I started getting these weird comments from her whenever our paths crossed. The first time we actually spoke was about 3 months after I moved in. I was washing my car in the driveway on a Saturday morning when she approached me with this fake smile that immediately put me on edge. She introduced herself as the executive secretary of the HOA board and started asking all these questions about the car. Where did I get it? How long had I owned it? Was it my daily driver? Things like that. I answered politely, but something about her tone made it clear she wasn't just making friendly conversation. Then she started making these subtle comments about how the neighborhood had certain aesthetic standards and how everyone needed to do their part to maintain the community's image. She never directly said anything about my car, but the implication was pretty obvious. I tried to stay diplomatic and just nodded along, but inside I was getting irritated. My car is in better condition than half the vehicles I see in the neighborhood, including some of the newer luxury cars that have door dings and scratched rims. Over the next couple of months, she started leaving these passive-aggressive notes on my windshield about various things. One was about making sure there were no oil stains on the driveway, which was ridiculous because my car doesn't leak anything. Another was about ensuring vehicles didn't block sight lines for pedestrian traffic, even though my car was parked completely within my own driveway boundaries and wasn't blocking anything. Each note had this official HOA letterhead and was signed with her title, making it seem like these were official board communications. I started to realize that she had it out for my car specifically. Other residents had vehicles parked in similar positions, some had actual oil stains on their driveways, and a few even had boats or RVs that were way more obtrusive than my little Honda. But none of them seemed to be getting these notes. It was becoming pretty clear that she had decided my car was somehow beneath the standards of the community, even though it was objectively in excellent condition. The harassment escalated when she started taking photos. I caught her several times standing at the edge of my driveway with her phone out, clearly documenting something about my car or property. When I asked her about it, she claimed she was just doing routine inspections for HOA compliance and that all properties were subject to the same scrutiny. But I started asking around, and none of my neighbors had ever seen her taking photos of their driveways or vehicles. I decided to install a Ring doorbell and security camera system, partly because of her behavior and partly because I just wanted to keep an eye on my property in general. The cameras covered the driveway, front yard, and side yard areas, and I made sure they were positioned to capture anyone approaching my car. Things seemed to calm down for a few weeks after I installed the cameras. I thought maybe she had gotten the hint that I was paying attention and would back off, but I should have known that someone willing to harass a neighbor over a perfectly legal and well-maintained vehicle wouldn't be deterred that easily. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday night. I had gotten home from work around 6 p.m., parked in my usual spot in the driveway, and gone inside to make dinner and relax for the evening. It had been a long day, and I was looking forward to just watching some TV and going to bed early so I could get up for an early morning meeting the next day. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. because I needed to be at the office by 6:30 for a conference call with our East Coast clients. When the alarm went off, I got up, made coffee, grabbed my work bag, and headed outside to start my car and let it warm up while I finished getting ready. But when I walked out my front door with my coffee mug in hand, I stopped dead in my tracks. The spot where my car should have been was completely empty. Just an empty patch of gray stone driveway staring back at me. My first thought was that someone had stolen it. I walked around the driveway looking for broken glass or any signs of a break-in, but there was nothing. No glass, no metal fragments, no tire marks, nothing that would suggest someone had forced their way into the vehicle. It was like the car had just vanished into thin air. I immediately called the police to report a stolen vehicle, but while I was on hold waiting for dispatch, I remembered the security cameras. I pulled up the app on my phone and started scrolling through the overnight footage. What I found made my blood boil. At 11:47 p.m. the night before, the cameras clearly showed a tow truck pulling up in front of my house. But here's the thing that really got to me. Standing right there on the sidewalk, directing the whole operation, was my HOA neighbor. She was pointing at my car, gesturing for the tow truck driver to position his equipment, and the whole time she had her phone out recording the process. The look on her face was one of pure satisfaction, like she was finally getting some kind of revenge. The footage showed the tow truck driver hooking up my car and loading it onto the flatbed, with her standing there the entire time like she was supervising the operation. Once my car was secured on the truck, she actually walked closer and took several more photos before the truck drove away. Then she stood there for another minute or two, just staring at my empty driveway, before walking back to her own house. I was absolutely livid. This woman had somehow arranged to have my car towed from my own private driveway in the middle of the night, and she looked like she was enjoying every second of it. I immediately called the police back and explained that this wasn't a theft but an unauthorized tow, and I had video evidence of who was responsible. The officer I spoke to said that while it was definitely suspicious, I would need to contact the towing company first to understand what grounds they claimed for the tow. He suggested that if I couldn't resolve it directly with the company, I could file a report for unauthorized vehicle removal. So my next step was trying to figure out which towing company had taken my car. I called around to several local companies until I found the right one. When I finally got through to their dispatch, the person I spoke to was immediately dismissive and rude. The dispatcher told me that my vehicle had been towed for unauthorized parking in a communal zone and that I would need to pay the towing fee plus daily storage charges to get it back. When I explained that the car was parked in my own driveway on private property, he just repeated the same line about communal zones and told me I could pick up the vehicle once I paid the fees. I asked to speak to a manager, and after being put on hold for 15 minutes, I was told that no manager was available and that I could discuss the matter when I came to pay the fees and retrieve my vehicle. The whole conversation felt like they had dealt with this exact situation before and had their responses all scripted out. At this point, I realized I needed to confront the person who had orchestrated this whole thing. I was still furious, but I decided to approach it calmly and see if she would at least explain her reasoning. Maybe there was some kind of misunderstanding that could be resolved without involving lawyers or law enforcement. I walked over to her house around 8 a.m. and rang the doorbell. When she answered, she had this smug expression on her face like she had been expecting me. Before I could even say anything, she started talking about how she hoped I had learned my lesson about following community standards. I took a deep breath and asked her as politely as I could manage why she had arranged to have my car towed from my own driveway. Her response was absolutely unbelievable. She explained that while my driveway might technically be on my property because it was visible from the street, it fell under what she called visual easement rules. According to her interpretation of the HOA bylaws, this meant that any vehicle parked in a location visible from public areas was subject to community standards and HOA enforcement actions. She went on to say that my car, regardless of its condition, did not meet the aesthetic standards expected in our neighborhood, and that she had tried to work with me informally for months to address the issue. Since I had refused to cooperate, she had no choice but to take official action. But here's the part that really showed how power-hungry and vindictive she was. She told me that in order to get my car back, I would need to pay not just the $450 towing fee and the daily storage charges, but also a $100 HOA fine for violating community standards. And even after paying all of that, I would need to agree to keep the vehicle in my garage rather than the driveway going forward. I stood there listening to this ridiculous explanation, trying to process the fact that this woman had essentially stolen my car and was now demanding ransom money to get it back. The whole visual easement thing sounded like complete nonsense, but she was saying it with such confidence that I wondered if there was actually some obscure HOA rule I wasn't aware of. I told her I needed to review the HOA documents before agreeing to anything, and she just shrugged and said that was fine, but the storage fees would continue to accumulate every day until I paid up. She also mentioned that she had documentation of all her previous attempts to address the issue informally, implying that she had been building a case against me for months. As I walked back to my house, I was trying to decide between just paying the fees to get my car back or fighting this thing properly. The money wasn't really the issue, although $450 plus daily storage was definitely going to hurt. What really bothered me was the principle of the whole thing and the fact that if I gave in now, she would probably just find other ways to harass me in the future. I decided to do some research before making any decisions. I spent the rest of the morning at the county clerk's office, pulling all the official documents related to my property and the HOA. The first thing I looked at was the original plat map for the neighborhood. This document clearly showed the exact boundaries of my property, including the driveway area. According to the official county records, my driveway was 100% on my private property with no easements or shared ownership arrangements of any kind. Next, I requested copies of the HOA's CC and Rs, which are the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that govern the community. These are the actual legal documents that spell out what the HOA can and cannot do and what obligations homeowners have. After reading through the entire document, I found several things that completely contradicted what she had told me. First, there was absolutely no mention of visual easement rules or any provision that would give the HOA authority over vehicles parked on private property just because they were visible from the street. But more importantly, I found a section that specifically outlined the procedures for vehicle towing within the community. According to the official HOA bylaws, any vehicle towing from private property required a written notice to be delivered to the property owner at least 24 hours before the tow. This notice had to specify the violation, the deadline for correction, and the consequences of non-compliance. I had never received any such notice. All those passive-aggressive notes she had left on my windshield were just her personal complaints, not official HOA enforcement actions. I also found another section that specified that all towing had to be authorized by a majority vote of the HOA board, not just by one individual board member acting alone. Armed with this information, I decided to dig deeper into the relationship between the HOA and the towing company. I requested copies of any contracts or agreements between the two organizations. This is where things got really interesting. The clerk pulled up the records and found that there was indeed a contract between the HOA and the towing company, but when I looked at the dates, I nearly fell out of my chair. The contract had expired 2 weeks before my car was towed. Let me say that again. The towing company had absolutely no legal authority to remove vehicles from our community because their contract with the HOA had lapsed and hadn't been renewed. I asked the clerk to print out copies of everything, and she was happy to help. She even pointed out some additional details that I might find useful. Apparently, when a towing contract expires, the company is supposed to return all access devices and cease all operations within the community immediately. They're definitely not supposed to continue towing vehicles based on expired agreements. I left the county office with a folder full of documentation that completely destroyed the foundation of what had happened to my car. Not only had the proper procedures not been followed, but the entire tow had been conducted by a company that had no legal right to be operating in our community at all. Now I was faced with a choice. I could go through official channels, file complaints with various agencies, and wait weeks or months for bureaucrats to sort everything out while my car sat in an impound lot racking up daily storage fees. Or I could use this information to put immediate pressure on the people responsible and get my car back right away. I decided to be proactive. My first call was to the towing company, but this time I was prepared. I live in a one-party consent state, which means I can legally record phone conversations as long as I'm one of the participants. I started recording before I dialed their number. When I got through to the dispatcher again, I asked to speak with a manager, and this time I wasn't taking no for an answer. I explained that I had documentation proving that their company had no authority to tow vehicles from my community and that I needed to speak with someone who could authorize the immediate return of my vehicle. After another long hold, I finally got connected with someone who identified himself as the company manager. I could tell right away that his attitude was completely different from the dispatcher. He sounded nervous, like maybe word had already gotten around that there were problems with their community contracts. I started by asking him a simple question. Who had signed the authorization for my vehicle to be towed from private property? He told me that all tows from our community were authorized by the HOA executive secretary and that my vehicle had been reported as being in violation of community parking standards. I then asked him if he was aware that his company's contract with the HOA had expired 2 weeks ago and that they currently had no legal agreement allowing them to operate within our community. There was a long pause on the line before he asked me to hold while he checked their records. When he came back, his tone was completely different. He started asking me where I had gotten that information and whether I was sure about the dates. I told him that I had copies of the original contract and the expiration documentation from the county clerk's office, and that I was looking at them right now. I also mentioned that I had video evidence of the tow taking place and that it clearly showed the HOA secretary directing the operation. This is when I decided to apply some pressure. I explained to him that taking a vehicle from private property without proper authorization constitutes theft under state law, and that operating a towing business under an expired contract could result in the loss of their business license. I also pointed out that predatory towing, especially when it involves improper relationships with HOA board members, carries significant civil penalties. I gave him 1 hour to return my vehicle to my driveway at no charge, or I would be filing police reports for theft and contacting the state agencies that oversee towing company licenses. I also mentioned that I would be pursuing civil litigation for triple damages, which is allowed under our state's predatory towing laws. The manager tried to backtrack and suggested that maybe there had been some kind of misunderstanding, but I cut him off. I told him I wasn't interested in excuses or explanations. I wanted my car back in my driveway within 1 hour, or I would assume that his company was willfully participating in what was essentially an extortion scheme. Before ending the call, I asked him one more time to confirm who had authorized the tow, and he again named the HOA executive secretary. Perfect. My next step was to contact the rest of the HOA board and make sure they knew exactly what had been done in their name. I had gotten the contact information for all board members when I first moved in, so I composed an email that included the video footage of my car being towed, copies of the plat map showing my driveway was private property, documentation of the expired towing contract, and copies of the HOA bylaws showing that proper procedures hadn't been followed. But here's where I decided to add a little extra pressure. I have a friend who works as a litigation attorney for a firm that handles a lot of HOA disputes and property law cases. I asked him if he would be willing to let me copy him on the email to the board, and he agreed. I made sure his law firm's letterhead was clearly visible when I copied him on the message. In the email, I explained exactly what had happened and pointed out all the legal violations that had occurred. I made it clear that I expected my vehicle to be returned immediately and that I would be seeking compensation for the harassment I had endured. I also mentioned that if this matter wasn't resolved quickly and appropriately, I would be forced to pursue legal action that could put the entire HOA at financial risk. I sent the email to all 5 board members and copied my attorney friend. Then I sat back to see what would happen. I didn't have to wait long. Within 30 minutes, I got a call from the towing company manager. He was clearly panicked and told me that they were dispatching a truck immediately to return my vehicle. He kept apologizing and claiming that there had been some kind of communication breakdown, but I wasn't interested in his explanations. True to his word, a flatbed tow truck showed up at my house about 45 minutes after I had given them the ultimatum. The driver looked absolutely miserable as he unloaded my car and carefully positioned it back in my driveway. I could tell he wasn't happy about losing what was probably a decent commission from the impound fees, but that wasn't my problem. I did a quick inspection of the car and was relieved to find that there was no visible damage from the towing or storage. Everything looked exactly the same as when it had been taken. But the real fireworks were just getting started. About an hour after my car was returned, I got a phone call from the HOA board president. He sounded stressed and asked if we could meet to discuss the situation. I agreed, but only if the meeting included all board members and excluded the executive secretary who had caused the whole mess. The meeting was scheduled for that evening at the community clubhouse, and when I arrived, I could tell that the other board members were taking this very seriously. They had printed copies of all the documentation I had sent them, and it was clear they had spent time reviewing everything carefully. The board president started by apologizing for what had happened and acknowledging that proper procedures hadn't been followed. But then he started asking questions that made it clear they were realizing the full scope of the problem. It turned out that the executive secretary had been authorizing vehicle tows for months without getting board approval, which was a clear violation of their own bylaws. She had been telling the other board members that she was just issuing warnings and working with residents to address parking issues, but she had actually been having vehicles towed and keeping the board out of the loop. Even worse, they discovered that she had been forging board approval signatures on towing authorizations. The towing company had dozens of documents with fake signatures that she had created to make it look like the board had approved specific enforcement actions. The implications of this were staggering. If other residents found out that they had been subjected to unauthorized tows based on forged documents, the HOA could be facing multiple lawsuits that would completely wipe out their reserves and potentially require special assessments on all homeowners. The board president asked me directly what it would take to resolve the situation without involving lawyers or law enforcement. I could tell they were terrified about the potential financial consequences if this became a bigger legal issue. I thought about it for a moment and then laid out my terms. First, the executive secretary needed to be removed from her position immediately, with no severance or benefits. Second, the HOA needed to pay for a complete professional detailing of my car to check for any damage from the towing process. Third, I wanted a full year's credit on my HOA dues as compensation for the harassment and stress I had endured. And finally, I wanted a written letter of apology from the board acknowledging that my vehicle had been improperly towed and that I had done nothing wrong. The board members looked at each other for a few seconds before the president nodded and said they could agree to those terms. They scheduled an emergency board meeting for the next evening to formalize the executive secretary's removal and draft the apology letter. I left that meeting feeling pretty satisfied, but the best part was still to come. 2 days later, I was outside washing my car when I saw a moving truck pull up in front of the executive secretary's house. Apparently, the embarrassment of being forced to resign and having her neighbors find out about her fraudulent activities was too much for her to handle. Over the next week, I watched as she packed up her belongings and prepared to leave the neighborhood. A few of my neighbors stopped by to tell me they had heard about what happened and that they were glad someone had finally stood up to her. It turned out that several other residents had been dealing with her harassment as well, but none of them had known how to fight back effectively. The day before she moved out, I was in my driveway applying a fresh coat of wax to my car when she walked by with her dog. I looked up and gave her a cheerful wave, and the look on her face was absolutely priceless. Here I was, enjoying my beautiful restored car in my own driveway, exactly where it belonged, while she was being forced to leave the neighborhood in shame. The HOA followed through on all their promises. They paid for a high-end detailing service to thoroughly clean and inspect my car, credited my account for a full year of dues, and sent me a formal letter of apology that acknowledged their executive secretary had acted improperly and without authority. They also implemented new policies requiring all enforcement actions to be approved by a majority of the board and created a formal appeals process for residents who felt they had been treated unfairly. The whole experience taught me some important lessons about dealing with power-hungry people and the importance of knowing your rights. If I had just paid the towing fees and accepted her demands, she would have continued harassing me and probably would have escalated to even worse behavior. But by doing my research, documenting everything, and using the legal system to my advantage, I was able to turn the tables completely. She went from thinking she had all the power to realizing that her fraudulent activities could have destroyed the entire HOA's finances. The irony is that she brought the whole thing on herself. If she had just left me alone and focused on actual violations instead of making up fake rules to harass people she didn't like, none of this would have happened. Her own vindictiveness and dishonesty created the situation that ultimately forced her out of the neighborhood. Now I park my car in my driveway every single day, and I take extra time to keep it looking perfect just because I can. Sometimes I'll see the new HOA board members when they're out for walks, and they always wave and ask how the car is running. It's amazing how much more pleasant the neighborhood became once the toxic person was removed from a position of authority. I still can't believe someone thought they could steal my car from my own driveway and demand ransom money to get it back. But I'm glad it happened in a way, because it taught me that bullies usually fold pretty quickly when you fight back with facts and legal documentation instead of just getting angry and yelling. For anyone dealing with similar HOA harassment, my advice is to document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to use official channels when people abuse their authority. These neighborhood tyrants count on residents being too intimidated or too busy to fight back properly. But when you show them that you're willing to hold them accountable for their actions, they usually back down pretty quickly. And for what it's worth, my car is still running perfectly and looks better than ever. Sometimes the best revenge really is just continuing to enjoy the things that made them angry in the first place. The next one is a malicious compliance story. This story is from many years ago, from when I was 19 to 20. I used to work for a resort. The same resort 3 separate times in many different job roles, so prepare for other stories. This was my second time working there when I did dishwashing. I kind of got the job accidentally, which is another story entirely. Anyways, they held a Hawaiian luau event which involved renting a custom-built whole pig spit roast that fit 2 pigs. As a seasoned adult who has now enjoyed a lifetime of good barbecue, this thing was beautiful. As someone who thought they were an adult, this thing was a large inconvenience and a waste of money. I didn't get to participate in any of the food, but I did get to see the dishes. Me and my coworker went out in the loading dock to take a break as one of the chefs rolled up with a golf cart towing the big ol' pig cooker. There are 2 types of chefs at this resort, the cool ones, and the type who is currently driving the golf cart. He lights up a cigarette and looks at the 2 of us, points at me and says, "Clean it." I walk up and take my first look inside. It looks like it's been through absolute hell. This is more than a shift worth of cleaning. I don't even know where to start. Well, they'll be here in 3 hours to pick it up, so you better start now, and when they get here, it better shine like new. How do you even clean something like this? I don't care, just make it shine. I know I'm being set up for failure, but I knuckle down. If I work my ass off but fail in the process, I'll be in less trouble than if I just don't try at all. I brought out the big guns. I went to the supply closet and got a brand new unused floor scrub brush, all the heavy chemicals in the garden hose. I spray the whole thing down in 4 cans of the heaviest degreaser we have, let it sit, and then literally stand inside and scrubbed. After an hour of scrubbing, I rinse to see the progress. Not much. I go to maintenance and grab a paint scraper and some Scotch pads out of their supply, another round of heavy chemicals, and I start scraping. Really making progress now. I work into a system. Chemicals, scrape, scrub, rinse, chemicals, scrap, scrub, rinse. I am on my knees in this thing, chipping away at the crap, and I heard the dock door open. It's one of the office guys, the chef, and someone else. "Right out here, he better have it clean for you." It's at this point I look up. The chef sees me, obviously not done, and has an evil grin. The office guy looks indifferent. The stranger, enraged horror. He comes running up and starts a tirade. I blank on what he says as my mind goes into survival mode. Usually people I see this angry are one really small thing away from physical violence. I don't remember the exact argument, but I do remember the guy being mad about how I was cleaning it with "you scrubbed off the flavor" and how it was seasoned, which meant nothing to me at that point in my life. The chef chimed in with, "Why would you do this? Don't you have any common sense?" My mind comes back into focus and I say, "You said you didn't care how I cleaned it, but to make it shine like new." There was a moment of silence and then he starts back at me telling me that I was done here and HR would have my butt for this. Like losing this job would ruin my life. The other dishwasher, like a knight with a moist dish towel over one shoulder, appears in the doorway. "Dude, you literally told him to make it shine like new. I was standing right here." They made me stop where I was and rinse it off. We lost our deposit. I never got in trouble. Chef got his butt reamed. Things never got better there. But I felt vindicated. I am still good friends with that other dishwasher. The next one is an entitled people story. This happened last Friday. I, 32F, was driving into the city for a doctor's appointment for one of my last OBGYN appointments before having my new baby. My toddler son was in the back seat sleeping. Since I knew the appointment would interfere with his nap time, I chose to head there early and sit in the car until it was time for my appointment. Since it's a major city, it also means annoying parking, with either street parking, where half of the meters are for delivery trucks or passenger loading, and the other half for normal cars. There is an obviously way more expensive garage next door with tight spaces that makes taking out a young child while 9 months pregnant almost impossible. With that being said, I was prepared to circle the block several times over for street parking since I had time to kill. Preferably would want parking on my driver's side as that's the side of the street my doctor's office is on and it'll be easier to unload my son. When I pull up, I see pretty much all of the spaces are taken, including the delivery and passenger loading spots. Not with delivery or passenger loading, just normal cars. However, there is one delivery truck blocking the very left lane, 3-lane road, one way, not including parking lanes on either side. I get around the truck and see there is one spot open, absolutely perfect space. I immediately get into the left lane, line up, put on my flashers, and start backing in. I'm part of the way into the space when I notice a car appear in my camera/mirrors. Confused, I stopped. It didn't appear that they were in the space, just blocking me from proceeding to back into. From there, I gathered the car might be trying to claim the space. By this point, the delivery truck had moved. Except they were pulling into the space. No blinkers, not properly aligned, just trying to rush into the space before I can finish backing in. I'm sitting there thinking, what is going on? Next thing I know, the driver, an old lady, gets out of their car and approaches my window. She tells me that this is her space, and she will be taking it, that she claimed it but was behind the delivery truck waiting on it to move. I tell her, no, it doesn't work that way. I am actively backing in and you don't get to claim it because you saw it first. She says, well, I'm taking it. I just tell her good luck and I'll wait. I know from how I'm already partly positioned in the space, she will not be able to maneuver into the space and will either have to give up or hit someone in the process. Sure enough, she spends several minutes trying as hard as she can to get into the space, never even getting close. She even got where her front end was now positioned more out of the space than her back end, but because she was pulling into the space, that obviously was the opposite of what she needed to do. From there, she decided to pull completely out of the space and into the middle lane. She lined up right next to me. I'm like, I might as well continue with my claim to the spot. Note, I hadn't moved even an inch the entire time she tried to get into the space. As I am backing in again, what does she try to do? Also back into the space. I stop once again because she is literally an inch away from taking off my mirror. She rolls down her window because now it's definitely pointless for her to try and claim the spot and starts cursing at me. I just wave with the biggest smile. Finally, after 5 to 10 seconds, she drives away while flipping me off. I finally am able to continue and finish backing into my space. I couldn't help but to think, how the heck did you think you were going to back into the space around a car that was partially in the space 2 lanes over? She'd be perpendicular to the actual space, and even if she wasn't, there is no way my back end wouldn't have been hit. I sat in the car for another 30 minutes before my son woke up and I took him out. All the while, no other space opened up. I did see her entering the building as I was taking my son out of his seat and putting him in the stroller. She glared at me and I gave her happy, friendly wave in return. Added info. I was initially in the lane behind the delivery truck and moved over to get around him. I couldn't see the open space from when I was in the same lane as it, so I call BS there. Also, who knows how long the truck wouldn't been there? It just so happens that they left right after I started backing in. Anyway, thank you for watching.